Welcome back, everyone. Today we're taking a deep dive into something you probably see every day but don't give much thought to, sand.
Yeah, it's everywhere, isn't it? But most people don't realize how incredibly diverse and important sand actually is.
Yeah, I have to admit, when I think of sand, it's just, well, sand. Beaches, sandbox.
Exactly, but there's so much more to it.
So is it all just like tiny little rocks?
Well, yeah, it is made of rock fragments, but it's way more complicated than that.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
So one example is what's called epiclastic sand, and this is formed by the weathering of mountains, over like thousands and thousands of years.
So those mountains slowly crumble and the little bits become sand.
Right, the wind and rivers carry those fragments, grinding them down, until they become the sand we see.
Wow, so each little grain has this huge journey behind it.
Yeah, kind of amazing, isn't it?
And it doesn't end there, does it? I mean, sand ends up in deserts, beaches, rivers.
Absolutely. And each environment shapes the sand in its own way.
That makes sense. So like desert sand is different from beach sand.
Exactly. Think about it. You get those smooth, rounded grains in the desert, from the constant wind.
Right, and that's why you don't really see buildings made of desert sand, I guess?
Exactly. It's pretty, but not very useful for building.
But beach sand, you can build with that. What makes it different?
The waves and the tides create rough, angular grains because it's constantly churning and grinding.
So they're kind of like jagged little pieces that lock together.
Precisely. And that gives concrete its strength.
So we're building our world on little bits of mountains and shells, basically.
Pretty much. But it's not just construction, Sand is vital for agriculture too, especially for crops that need good drainage.
Really? I would have thought sand would be too dry for crops.
You'd think so, but certain crops like watermelons, peaches, they thrive in sandy soil.
Huh. Interesting. Why is that?
It's all about the drainage. See, sand doesn't hold water like clay soils do.
Ah, so the roots don't rot. That makes sense.
Right. Even intensive dairy farms rely on sandy soils for waste management.
Wow, I had no idea. So those tiny grains have a huge impact on like what we eat.
Exactly. And of course there's glass. Remember learning that glass is basically melted sand?
Oh yeah, from back in school. But I bet there are other uses too, right?
Oh, absolutely. Specialized sands are used in foundries, to withstand those crazy high temperatures when they're casting metal.
I can see how that would be important.
And don't forget sandblasting uses sand abrasive power to clean and prep surfaces.
It's like sand is this hidden ingredient in everything. We just don't think about it much.
We really don't, but all those uses add up to a multi-billion-dollar global industry.
Wow, a multi-billion-dollar industry.
But here's the thing. That demand for sand is putting a lot of pressure on our resources, and that's where things get a bit complicated.
Wait, so even though sand is everywhere, we're running out of it?
It's not just about quantity, it's about the quality and access. Not all sand is created equal.
I see. So the kind of sand we need for certain things like construction, it's becoming harder to find.
Exactly.
So something as simple as sand can actually be a pretty big problem.
That's right. And to understand why, we need to look at the environmental impacts of sand extraction. Because it turns out there's a dark side to all that sand. Yeah, one of the biggest issues is dredging, taking sand from the ocean floor.
Oh yeah, I've heard about that. Sounds pretty destructive.
It is. Those dredgers, they're like giant vacuum cleaners, just sucking up everything.
So what happens to the marine life down there?
It's devastating, really. Imagine entire habitats just wiped out.
Wow.
Fish populations, they plummet because their breeding grounds are gone. And all that stirred up sediment, it can suffocate coral reefs and all those sensitive creatures.
It's like a chain reaction, right?
Yeah.
One problem leads to another.
Exactly. And it doesn't stop there. Dredging can change the currents and how the waves move.
So it affects the coastline too.
You bet. Leads to erosion, even more flooding in some areas. The impact goes way beyond the dredging site itself.
We don't always think about those connections, do we? Just taking what we need without considering the consequences.
That's right. And it's ironic because we're trying to build things with sand, but taking too much actually makes some coastal communities more vulnerable.
So we're kind of undermining our own infrastructure by depleting this resource.
Yeah, kind of crazy when you think about it.
So are there any solutions? What are people doing to address this?
Some countries are getting serious. They're banning sand exports altogether to protect their own resources.
Makes sense.
And there's more pressure now to regulate the whole global sand trade.
So it's not just an environmental issue, it's economic and political too.
Exactly. And people are starting to realize, hey, maybe sand isn't as limitless as the thought.
Right, it's a finite resource.
Exactly. So there's this push to find alternatives, like manufactured sand.
You mentioned that earlier. Made from crushed rock, right?
Yep. It could be a good solution, but it's not perfect.
I bet. What are such the challenges?
Well, it can be pricier to make, and the process itself, crushing the rock, takes energy, resources.
So it's not a simple swap, just replacing one kind of sand with another?
Nope. Every approach has trade-offs, we got to think carefully about the whole picture, not just the immediate need, but the long-term impacts too.
So what can we do? I mean, just regular people, how can we be more responsible about using sand?
There are things we can do, like supporting companies that are extracting sand sustainably, doing it the right way.
Right, making conscious choices.
Exactly. And we can push for stronger regulations on the sand trade, making sure it's done responsibly.
And what about those alternative materials you mentioned?
We need more research and development in those areas.
So it's about individual choices, but also bigger systemic changes.
Yep, it's got to be both. We got to start thinking about sand differently, It's not just a cheap, endless commodity. It's a valuable resource, and we got to treat it that way.
That's a great point. We've talked about the environment, but what about the people involved? Are there communities that are really affected by this?
Oh, absolutely. In some developing countries, sand mining is a big source of income for local communities.
Right, I can see that.
But a lot of times it's unregulated, dangerous. Workers are exploited, facing unsafe conditions.
So it's a social justice issue, too.
Exactly. And then there's the whole issue of sand mafias, these criminal organizations.
And mafias? I've never heard of that.
They control illegal sand mining in some places. They use violence, intimidation to exploit these resources and silence anyone who speaks out.
Wow, that's scary. I guess it shows just how valuable this resource is.
Yeah, and how complex the issue is. It's not just about protecting the environment. It's about social justice and economic development, too.
So we've got a lot to think about.
We do. It's a complex problem, and it needs a multifaceted approach, to address all the different angles.
As we wrap up our deep dive into sand, what are the most important things you want our listeners to take away from this?
Well, first off, sand is not just some boring material, right? It's crucial for our civilization, and how we get it and use it has huge consequences.
We've seen that those consequences can be pretty serious.
Yeah, from harming the environment to affecting people's lives.
But it seems like there's hope, too.
Oh, definitely. There are solutions out there, like using manufactured sand and finding new building materials. And more people are realizing we need to do things differently.
It's like a wake-up call, right? We got to be more aware of where our resources come from and how our choices impact the world.
Exactly. We can all play a part in making sure sand is around for future generations, and that it's used responsibly.
It's wild, right? We started talking about beaches and sand castles, and now we're talking about, like, sand mafias and the fate of construction.
It just shows you, how everything's connected. Even something like sand can have these huge global impacts.
Definitely makes you think twice about, just taking it for granted.
Exactly.
So as we're wrapping our deep dive into the world of sand, what are the key things you hope listeners will take away from all this?
I think the biggest thing is sand isn't infinite, right? We've got to shift our thinking. It's not about abundance. It's about managing what we have responsibly.
Yeah, that makes sense.
That means understanding, where does our sand come from? How are we getting it? And what happens if we use too much?
And we've seen those consequences can be pretty serious, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Everything from, delicate ecosystems to people's lives.
But it's not all bad news, right? It seems like there are solutions out there.
Absolutely. There's manufactured sand, and people are developing new building materials. We're getting more creative.
So there's hope for a more sustainable future for sand.
Definitely. But it takes all of us, individuals, businesses, governments working together.
And that brings us to a final thought for our listeners. Knowing what you now know about sand, what are you going to do?
Right. What actions will you take to make sure this resource is around for, future generations? Think about it.
Yeah, will you buy products from companies that are doing things sustainably? Or maybe push for stronger regulations? Or even think about careers that, contribute to solutions?
There are so many ways to get involved.
It's a challenge for all of us, right? To think differently about the world around us. Even the things we take for granted, like the sand beneath our feet.
Well said.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Remember, even small actions can make a difference.